Good evening and welcome to what is the 12th installment of the Collective Pact virtual speaker series, Our Collective Power. We're going to get started in about 2 more minutes, so stay put. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I hope you all really enjoy the show that we have planned for you with our panelists today. Good evening again, and thank you all for joining us for what is our 12th installment, our second to last, our Collective Power virtual speaker series. Tonight, we have an amazing panel in store for you. But to tell you a little bit before we get started about the Collective Pact was founded in 2016 by Stephanie Brown James and Quentin James with the mission to bring more representation at every level of government when it came to Black candidates. Since our creation in 2016, we've helped elect over 55 candidates at every single level of government. And in this year, 2020, what we know will be the year of the Black candidate, we have over 160 endorsed candidates at every single level of government. So we are really excited about that. But without further ado, let's get to the subject tonight. We are on the East Coast, where we know our democracy was birthed out of. We have some exciting panelists for you. But first, before I bring up our panelists, I have to bring up my lovely and amazing co-host, Jamira Burley, representing Pennsylvania, Philadelphia for us. Next in the House, we have State Representative Summer Lee, joining us from Pennsylvania's 34th House District. We have Samara Brooke joining us as the Democratic nominee for New York's 55th State Senate District. My man Jamal Bowman, all of you have become quite familiar with him, representing the 16th House District, that is for Congress in New York. And last but not least, Dr. Cameron Webb, coming all the way from Virginia's 5th Congressional District. But without further ado, I will turn it over to my amazing co-host, Jamira.
Thank you so much, Chris, for introducing me and for welcoming to this amazing platform and event. I also want to shout out Collective PAC. I'm appreciative of any organization and individuals who are unapologetically, their mission is to activate and to organize the voices and the power of Black folks in order for us to get closer and closer to real Black liberation and justice for Black people. So I'm excited to moderate this panel. We are just days away from one of the most monumental elections of our lifetime. And I don't say that lightly. There is a lot at stake. And luckily enough, we have an amazing panel of folks who are not just voting, but who are actually taking up the mantle to deciding to be a part of the process by running for office and using their ideas and inspirational stories as a way to move this country forward. So I want to kick us off with our first question. First question being, all of you are running for very different positions at different levels of office. And I'm curious for you, what is the importance of educating and motivating young people to participate in the process and to use their voices to vote? And we can start with Mr. Webb, Dr. Webb, since you got introduced last.
Well, sounds good. Well, thanks so much for putting this together and for having us. And I guess the best way to answer that question is that young people, that's the future. Those are the voices that are going to truly shape the dynamics that we're going to see. We know that millennials are the largest voting bloc right now, but more than that, we just know that the energy and the ideas that are coming from young folks, they're shaping their own futures in so many ways. And so, what we have to do is we have to continue to have the conversations so that they know that it's important to participate, important to vote. Conversations I've had all over my congressional district. And I want to zoom out. I'm from Virginia, and born and raised. Yeah, he said you're sorry. But even still, being a Virginian, what I'll say is that, when I engage with folks, they're just like, I don't know if it's really going to make a difference. And I think you have one mentality about what it means to cast your vote when you see that there are these wide margins in how elections go. But I always go back to kind of the story of Jimmy Lee Jackson and Selma, Alabama, and John Lewis. And I just say, hey, what you're tapping into is a legacy of participation, a legacy of engagement, something that we fought for and we bled for. And I think that's part of what motivates people. And I think the other part of it is just recognizing this is our right as Americans. And I think as long as we're able to exert it and express ourselves, it's one of the ways we use our voices. Young people are energized. They're excited to vote. And we're seeing that all over the country right now. But I think more than anything, it's just us saying hey, we're excited to have you participating as well.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Summer Lee?
Yeah, so thank you all so much for having me here. Let's get that out of the way. But young people, that's one of the topics that really is near and dear to me in my campaign. All of my campaigns, right? So when I first started running, when we were building our grassroots campaign, we built it with and surrounding and centering young people. And when I mean young people, I don't mean just like me as a then, 29, 30-year-old candidate. I mean young people as in we had, 14-year-old interns, 15-year-old, 16-year-old. We were organizing high school students, not just around our campaign, but also helping them to be community organizers. And that was a really integral part of our campaign, because what I truly believe is that young people aren't just, they're not just excited. They're not just energetic. Young people are brilliant. And they can drive policy too. They know exactly what's going on. And not only do they know what's going on, but because they're young and fresh and closest to the issues, they can still conceive a world and see a world that so many folks have long since let go of. And that's important right now, because we're talking about how do we emerge from the ashes of multiple crises? How do we emerge from the ashes of our pandemic that is fundamentally changing American society and is showing American society the need to change? How do we emerge from the ashes of our racial crisis and our economic crisis and our environmental crisis? And these young people are the ones who have plans and vision, and they have not lost hope. Being able to world build and build a society that fits all of us is our charge right now. And in order to do that, it's important that we engage young folk, that we empower them, that we help them understand that, our society can't wait for them to grow up. Is what I always say to them. We can't wait for you to grow up. The world needs you. Society, America needs you right now. We need your opinions right now. We need your voice right now. We need your activism right now. We need your advocacy. And for some of them who are emerging onto the political scene, we need your electoral brilliance too. So that's how important the young vote is. And that's how important it is for us to empower and enfranchise young folks.
I'm so happy you mentioned that, because I agree. Having worked with young people for the last 15 years, is their ability to dream big without all the constraints of what society has told them is impossible, I think is refreshing and is needed, and oftentimes in spaces and places that are so boggled down with the political norm, right? Like, how do we still bring in those amazing and inspirational ideas to the fold? Thank you for sharing that. Samar, am I saying that right?
Samra.
Samra, I wanted to turn to you next, and thank you for the correction. I hate when people get my name wrong.
Okay, and I'm probably going to answer to Summer too. We joked about the fact that half the people call me Summer anyways, but we'll get through it together. So I just want to say thank you also to Collective for bringing this amazing group together. I think I don't want to repeat some of the amazing things that have just been said, because I think that these are really, really powerful points that the folks that just spoke made. I guess the thing that I would add is, more than voting and being involved in a grassroots level, which, by the way, I think should be the minimum, right? Mm-hmm. Coming out and having your voice heard, voting in election is the bare minimum we do as contributing citizens in this country. I want us to do the most. Let's do the most for young people. And that means also jumping in the political arena and running. And so I'm here, and I can't tell you how many times folks have told me, are you old enough to run for state senate? And I said, well, I think it's like 18. So yes, by a long shot, I could have an 18-year-old at this point. I am old enough to run for this seat. But that just shows, right, how not uncommon this is. Right? Folks aren't used to seeing young people jumping into the arena. Folks aren't used to seeing young people of color jumping into this arena, which I think is so crucial. And to be honest, it's honestly groups like the Collective that open up this space. This was one of the first trainings I took on running for office and how I got connected to this group, which changed the trajectory, gave me the tools, the connections, the confidence to be able to do it. So, I would take it a step further that, of course, we want to see all young people. If you're 18, please vote. If you live in a state that has same-day registration, unfortunately, New York is not there yet. I hope to get there. But if you do live in a state with that, it means it's not too late to register to vote and actually get out there and get your voice heard. But I want to see more young people, and especially young Black men and women, stepping into the political arena. I think Summer said it really, really well. You know how to dream. You have imagination that some folks who have been in this world or in politics for so long have lost. And if we're not able to harness that kind of creativity and imagination for what our world and our state and our society can be, then we will continue in the cycle that we have been in. Right? We will continue to see the same things that we complained about 20 years ago happening again. And we've already seen this. And so it's so crucial that we have not only new voices, but different voices that come with an energy and enthusiasm that cannot be matched. And I'm hopeful that watching all of these brilliant people on your screen today and continue, all the other events you all have done, continues to be motivation that voting, again, bare minimum. We need to do so much more if we really want to build up political power.
That's such a great point. And Jamal, oftentimes when we think about elections, folks get so consumed, with the presidential election. But we know that the president can only do so much unless he also has people in office down the ballot who can also push the agenda and ensure that we're not only pushing one specific issue at the national level, but in cities and states around the country. So again, why is it important to motivate and educate young people to not just vote, but vote all the way down the ballot?
I mean, our mission is to build political power for the next 100 years and more. And in order to build that political power, we have to engage young people at every level, at all ages, to ensure they're crystal clear and aware of how political power is built from an electoral standpoint at every level of government, but also at an organizing from an organizing perspective. Growing up as a kid, we focused mainly on the presidency. Right. And maybe we would have a conversation about governor or mayor. But we didn't have many conversations about people in Congress and the role of those in the House of Representatives or the role of those in the Senate. We didn't have much conversation about a state Senate or county office or city council. That's the education young people need right now through our K-12 school system. Civic engagement should be mandatory curriculum so that when kids graduate at 18, they're ready to engage in the process. And there are some who are pushing voting as young as 16 so that kids can get engaged much sooner. And it's because of the points that were brought up earlier. Our kids are brilliant. Our kids have unlimited potential. Our kids are experiencing, they have the lived experience of those we are trying to pass policy to support. They have those lived experiences. So when kids are talking about housing as a human right, is because they live in housing that's been neglected by our federal government for the last 30 years. When kids are talking about universal health care, it's because they probably have personal experiences from a family member or themselves and the impact of not having access to healthcare. When they talk about fully funding education, it's because they probably go to schools that are underfunded. When they talk about criminal justice reform or police reform, it's because they watched the murder of George Floyd and the murder of Eric Garner and the murder of Tamir Rice and the Breonna Taylor situation. They've watched these situations unfold and they don't understand, like young people are very wise in terms of their instincts, right? They're like, why aren't we doing more about this stuff? So in terms of consistent engagement, in terms of consistent education, we have to bring them into the fold and do everything we can to help them understand how all of this works so that we can build political power for the next 100, 200, 401 years. That's the only way we defeat racism and sexism and classism and xenophobia and anti-Semitism and discrimination, neglect in all its forms. It has to be engaging young people early and often throughout this process.
Exactly, and not just 3 days before the election, but that's another conversation. So Mara, as someone who cares about environmental justice, who cares about the peaceful and protecting the aging of elders, as well as education, we know that COVID-19 negatively impacted those issues specifically. And I'm curious, how are you going to use your passion, your ideas to intersect how these issues are directly impacting Albany?
That's a big one. That'll be probably my entire first term is tackling that. But we can break it down.
I have no fear that you will be able to solve all of those problems.
Give me 90 days. Give me 90 days and 1 out of 63 voices in the state Senate. We got this. I mean, I got Jamal there in Congress. We will figure this out for New York. Well, the truth is you actually said it perfectly in that what has COVID-19 done? It has essentially shown us where the fault lines are in our society and in this fabric that we've created that's supposed to support our communities. The fissures that all of us knew existed. Anybody who had their eyes open, who were looking in our communities, knew that these fissures existed, and they have just been blown wide open. There's no question now as to whether or not we have equitable access to healthcare. There's no question about it, because when you look at COVID-19, even up here in our community in Western New York, where, we are lucky that we did not have the kind of tragedies that the other states in New York City saw. But even up here, we make very clear lines when you look at who got COVID-19, who died from COVID-19, who's more susceptible to it. And it's along racial lines, it's along income lines. Even there's a correlation if you own or rent your home. And what that tells us is that we have completely missed the mark in terms of getting people the access to healthcare that they need, equitable and quality healthcare. And that also goes, we talked about seniors that you brought up. I did help to start a company that helps seniors get services in their homes. And you saw this happen here in Western New York similarly, where seniors were at greater risk, but those who were low income, those who lived in rural areas. My own grandmother is 81 years old, and we were struggling to get her high-speed internet enough so that she could have her virtual health appointments. These are, in some cases, life and death appointments. You can't just put them off until the pandemic is over, right? And similarly, we look at climate change because we mentioned the environment. I spent several years working with city governments on combating climate change. Well, now let's look at the folks who have been most hurt by COVID-19. This is a respiratory illness. When you have asthma, when you have mold in your homes because you don't have safe housing, those are all things that become comorbidities and all kind of pile on to exacerbate the situation we find ourselves in. So when I think about how COVID-19 has affected our communities, it's honestly just putting an exclamation point on the issues that we already started this campaign on, right? We already started it talking about environmental justice, talking about housing justice, healthcare justice, racial justice, social justice. All of these things, to me, have just gotten louder. So my hope now is that we can get something done in these very short 2-year terms, because we are now in a position where any deniers of these facts all they have to do is look at the headlines. It's very clear where we stand, especially as New York State. And so my hope is that we can use that energy and momentum to say, let's make a decision, at least on the New York level. I know Jamal and Dr. Webb are going to work on this in the federal level, but at least in New York, let's just say after this COVID-19 that no one loses their life because they can't get to a doctor. Can we at least say that New York believes that? There are simple things that I think we can decide on, that humanity is more important than some of our corporate interests, if you will, here in the state. And so I think that is what I'm hopeful for. I'm hopeful that in addition to having new leadership, more Democrats, more people who believe in these things in the state Senate will help, but also that we can't ignore it anymore. And that we need to be able to face the fact that this is where our systems got us. So clearly they're not working.
Such a great point. And I'm happy to know that you're going to be in Albany, because I think to your point is right at this moment, we are making a very blatant decision on what and who do we value. And the fact that thousands of people are dying due to very preventable situations is a prime example that we need to reevaluate who we're valuing in this country, not only in New York. Also, I think to your point is that, COVID-19 showed us that things that we used to take for granted, like cable and internet, actually should be seen as essential and utilities and not just luxuries, because they could be life or death for people who need to get access to their jobs, doctors. Keeping on a line with the COVID-19 and the implications of COVID-19, Jamal, you are a former middle school principal and a public school advocate. And I'm a firm believer that people who work in public education are the real superheroes. So thank you. You have a very direct knowledge of those who have been impacted specifically in the education sector due to COVID-19, right? We know that teachers are now being forced to work without PPE, or being forced to work despite health conditions. We know that young people are being forced to now reevaluate how their educational experience is happening from elementary all the way to college. And I'm curious for you, when you win, right? Putting it in the universe, when you win, how are you planning to take those stories, those voices, those lived realities to Congress to ensure that we're not only thinking about another stimulus check, but more importantly, how are we thinking more strategically about legislation that's going to ensure that those people are not forgotten as Congress continues to go about its business?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And my conversation always begins with our children, and it begins with our most vulnerable children. Our children with special needs, for example, have to be centered when we talk about reopening our schools and responding to what's happening with COVID. Our children in early childhood, beginning at the age of 3 and 4 and 5, and their needs, we have to center them as we talk about our response to COVID. What has happened, and mainly this has happened because Republicans have control of the Senate and we still have Donald Trump in the White House, there's been no second wave of stimulus. And that's key, because without that second wave, we haven't been able to retrofit our schools for proper circulation. And if we have kids going into classrooms without proper circulation, they're more likely to contract the pandemic. That's number one. We also have schools where some schools don't even have windows in classrooms, and other schools can't even open those windows. So we can't even get natural circulation inside our classrooms. You mentioned lack of PPE. There's also a lack of testing and contact tracing when it comes to our schools. And then finally, because here in New York, we were so disorganized and there was no collaboration amongst advocates and elected officials, people were pretty much fighting each other in terms of not just when to reopen, but how to reopen. So that lack of collaboration, that lack of transparency created a lack of trust for many of our families. And as a result, families decided not to send their kids back to school. Well, guess what? At the very least, at last count, 70,000 kids didn't even have the hardware to access remote learning. And the point was made earlier about utilities. Many kids and families don't have access to the Wi-Fi that they need to access remote learning. And my wife is a second grade teacher. So I've watched her go through this stress and these trials and tribulations since we closed schools back in March. There wasn't a plan. There wasn't collaboration. There's a lack of resources coming from our federal government. So it's been a failure of leadership, beginning with the feds, but also at the state and city level. And as I mentioned, the bottom line is this: if one child gets sick and dies, we have failed all children throughout our country. And unfortunately, many of my colleagues in Washington do not center our children. And that's why we got to beat Trump. We got to flip the Senate. We got to take back power. But then we have to hold everyone accountable to ensure that we're investing in our learning spaces, not just schools, but communities, to make sure our kids are as safe as they possibly can be.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I know folks are tired of hearing people like me say that this is a election, a do or die election, but the reality is people are dying in between elections because of the decisions that we either choose to make by participating or not participating. So yeah, a lot is at stake. So that being said, I'm actually going to turn it over to Representative Lee because, from the great state of Pennsylvania, the election cycle, we are seeing strong Republican seats flip blue simply because for the first time in decades, there are young Black progressive challengers who are upending their career, and as you are no stranger to being the first doing this out of Southwestern Pennsylvania, you upseated the representative who had that seat by more than 60% of the votes. And so why is it important for these kind of races? And what would you say to other young Black candidates who are thinking about running in these kind of elections, but may be afraid, they feel like it's the first time? What would you say to them to encourage them to get out and vote? I mean, to not get out and vote, but to get out and run.
Yeah, so the thing about running, and especially the thing about young Black folks and other marginalized folks also, we are often kind of conditioned to disqualify ourselves, to really kind of misinterpret or at least be convinced that certain qualifications for these roles are kind of out of our grasp, which kind of delays us getting into these fields, delays us kind of taking that plunge. And the other thing is that, we also kind of are more inclined to not see ourselves in these positions anyways. When I first ran, it was deciding between, fighting the power and taking the power. And fighting the power is something that we are accustomed to saying in our tradition, in our community. And taking the power is not something that we had necessarily had a blueprint for, but it changes things and it shifts the atmosphere. It's really a paradigm shift and I think it's been said many times that voting is the bare minimum that we can do here. I often tell people that when we have someone to vote for, we will show up. And we've seen that with Barack Obama. We've seen that in election cycles where Black and brown folks are represented on the ballot. But we not only will show up, but we'll also be able to kind of spark that sort of movement that we need to get more and more people to come. And it makes a difference. What I want to say to, especially young Black folks who are considering whether they should run, first of all, imagine that your identity, your experience, your perspective is absolutely a qualification. The way you navigate this society qualifies you for so very many of these roles. It may not qualify you to be the president, but when we're talking about the people's house, whether that's the people's state house or the federal house, that's still the people's house. You have a qualification there. You have a perspective there that is sorely needed. And it's so important that if we are going to talk about the systemic changes that we need, if we're going to talk about dismantling systems, that we have to see ourselves as that being our responsibility and also that being within our wheelhouse. So yeah, so you are qualified. You're also qualified as you. One of the things that a lot of young and Black and brown folks learn when they're going to run, especially when they're going up against Republicans or if they're going up against, well-established people, they convince themselves that they have to present themselves in a very particular way, that you have to sound like a politician and act like a politician and move like a politician. You got to tweet like a politician. The reality is that the reason why we're seeing these young Black and brown folks get to office is because people are wanting that shakeup. We're wanting people who look like us and sound like us and experience life like us. So we want you to show up as you. We want you to show up as us, and you are allowed to do that. Run as you. If you aren't comfortable, wearing the suit all the time, but that's not you. That's not you. And if your experience is a teacher, or as your experiences as a tradesman, or if your experiences as somebody who has grown up Black in the hood, Black in a poor community, Black in public housing, that's an experience. That's policy experience. So be your authentic self, come as you, and you will find out that if we wanted more people who are just going to get in to fit in, then we would keep the person in who's in now. We want people who are going to get in the up in, and that's where you come in. That's where there is space for us. So that's what I want to see. That's what I think the people all across our country want to see. They want to see us step up as us. They want to see us represent as us. And that is where we have our greatest opportunity to not just take, seats in this cycle. That's where we have our greatest opportunity to transform our society and start to rebuild the society, like I said, we need to do in my first question.
Oh my God. So now I feel like I need to pass the collection plate around so folks can drop you a little bit of money for all of those gems you just gave us. And to be honest, what we know about elections and the standards of who is a politician, it's created by old white men who for too long had too much power. So of course the standards needs to change as we continue to diversify. And actually I have a follow-up for you, Representative Lee, because we know that one of the reasons why Black women of color, people of color oftentimes don't run because of the social economic aspect of running for office, like the ability to raise the funds. And so I'm curious for you, was that a barrier, or what was a barrier for you in your efforts to run against an incumbent?
I think there were a lot of traps that we were blessed to be able to tiptoe around. Mm-hmm. But to be 100% real, I'm the first Black woman to represent Western Pennsylvania. We've had no Black women in Congress from Pennsylvania at all, from any part, including Philadelphia. We've had no women serve as senators. In Pittsburgh, we've had no Black mayors. We've had no Black folks in our executive offices at all. Mm-hmm. When I ran the first time, I didn't expect that sort of institutional help. I was running against a 20-year incumbent whose entire family was in office. But when I ran the second time, I was the incumbent. And I had spent the last year hearing nonstop about how we have to protect our incumbents. We have to protect our incumbents. I heard the word incumbent protection more than I've heard anything else. And I'm not even exaggerating. So when we went for the endorsement of the Allegheny County Democratic Party, I didn't get it. Mm-hmm. And I also didn't get the endorsement of the Labor Council, even though I've been on every picket line that we could possibly have, even though the platform that we have is so labor, so working class and poor centered, that it's almost unconscionable to say that we would not support, because the support has already been a mutual thing. So to have not gotten that, it caused an uproar because the Democratic Party continues to rely on Black women to fuel its very success. And that's not just at the presidency, that's all the way up and down the board. Black women have been carrying the Democratic Party on its back, but we have not seen more Black candidacies. We've not seen more Black women Black women in films and trans folks getting in the upper level executive director positions or running the party. You don't see us in those positions. And that's where the disconnect is with the Democratic Party. But not only do we have that barrier, but we also have the barrier of money. You have to raise so much money to run in some of these races. Depending on like a state house race, it can be anywhere from a little less to 100,000 to 300, 400,000. When you're in Congress, to the millions. When you're running for U.S. Senate, $30-something million. And if you're not somebody who's money, that's where we get people who are poor, people who are marginalized, who don't have those connections, those networks. We can't go to the country club, or if you're not a lawyer, you can't go to the defense attorneys and say, I just need I need some money. You know, we can't do that. We have to find different ways of engaging people. It forces us though. So I say they're barriers, but they're also opportunities, because it forces us to engage and expand the electorate in ways that the old boys club, that those old white men don't have to do, that rich folks don't have to do. So those are things that we have to consider. It's why the collective PAC and other PACs like it are so important. It's why having people who are dedicated to building Black political power, recognizing that we need campaign managers, we need field directors, we need donations, we need all of those things, not just candidates. We need the infrastructure to run and support our candidates. That's why I had to create my own PAC here in Pittsburgh to do the same thing. So it's charging us with really thinking outside of the box when it comes to seizing that power, because again, as we know, power can seize nothing without a demand. Well, those demands have to be strong. Those demands have to be strong, and we have to be strong to take them. So there's a lot, and I'm sure everybody else on this panel has experienced this.
Yeah, we talk about generational wealth all the time, but we never really talk about how generational debt can be a barrier to folks participating in the process. I want to turn it over to Dr. Webb. Affordable healthcare insurance is one of the primary issues of your campaign, which is understandable as you are a practicing physician. It's nice to have more people who come from the professions that they're trying to change. With that being said, many Americans rely on healthcare from their employer. Medicaid and Medicare is constantly being stripped away, and independent insurance is expensive. And big pharma controls prescription prices. What does healthcare reform look like to you, and how do you plan to attack the problem once you are elected?
Great question. I have to start off by saying Summer Lee is on fire right now. So I like, it's hard to like jump in and get back into a real policy-centric conversation when it's preaching over here. So I have to say that. And one of my good friends is one of your colleagues, Morgan Cephas. We were in college together. And I know you got a hustle background. My sister's a hustle grad too. So it's good to meet you. And also, you know, it's just great to hear all the perspectives. Sorry, I'm giving out roses right now. But Samra, you are bringing fire when it comes to COVID and talking about the reality of the dynamics that we have. And I think so many people think that this virus, where I live, people don't even think this virus is real. So you have to understand we are dealing with so many different kinds of dynamics. But I love how you were able to break that down really thoughtfully and describe the reality. And Dr. Bowman, I can't wait to be your colleague, man. I think we got to get this done in 9 days. But I think that you bring that perfect perspective when we talk about centering around our kids. And so it's great to be with all of you. When I talk about healthcare, I want to start off by saying a couple of things. First is that I believe wholeheartedly that it is our responsibility, our requirement to achieve this idea of universal health coverage immediately, right? And when you think about what that means, how that's defined, the World Health Organization defines it as 3 things. It means that everybody has access to the healthcare that they need. That's the first. The second is that it's of sufficient quality to be effective. And then the third is that accessing that healthcare does not result in financial harm. Those are the 3 tenets. And my thing is that no health reform that we do in the United States in the near future can violate any of those 3 premises. We have to accomplish that urgently. So then the next question is, well, what does that look like in other places, right? People are caught up on what a uniquely American solution can be. But if you look around the world, we've seen that play out different ways. And I actually teach a class about this at the University of Virginia. But sure, you can have, you know, models like they have in Germany that's a mix of public and private, or you know, Switzerland and the Netherlands. You can have models like they have in the UK that's a single payer system where they have both a public delivery and a public payment side of things, right? They kind of marry those 2 things together. I think where I always start is, what is the current state of our healthcare system? And in short form, it's incredibly broken. We have an incredibly broken healthcare system that distances too many people from opportunity, right? So I'm on the Medicaid board here in Virginia. We just expanded Medicaid in January of 2019. So without that, you know, 469,000 people in my Commonwealth would not have access to care. During this pandemic, 65,000 people wouldn't have access to care. So Medicaid has been huge in terms of meeting the needs of our communities. And we're also able to tie it to certain really critical needs in terms of housing, in terms of transportation and other things. So I recognize the value of that particular program. The Medicare program since 1965 has had a tremendous role, especially when you added Part D, the prescription drug benefit, and what that's done for seniors. And we've seen through Medicare Part D, and this is where I get into, sorry, I'm getting to professor mode real quick. But this is where we get into, you know, what are the models we've seen that are effective in the United States? And Medicare Part D, And I talk about being a consensus builder because I think you do have to be able to connect with people across a range of backgrounds to move the ball forward sometimes. But Medicare Part D was passed by George W. Bush in 2003, the Medicare Modernization Act. And what that did is it created this prescription drug benefit. But he said on the front end, he said, I'm only giving you $400 billion. That's all you get, right? $400 billion to fix prescription drugs for seniors. And so the legislators were left with this conversation of, well, we're going to pay the first dollar for everybody so all seniors benefit. And then we're going to pay the highest dollars for some seniors so that nobody's going broke. And it left the donut hole that everybody knows. Everybody knows there's a donut hole. They don't know it's just because the government didn't put enough money into the program. But even still, Medicare Part D provides more options, more access to prescription drugs. It's a better health program than almost any federal health program that we've created. And it's something that across the board, people agree with. You never hear somebody saying, I'm here to get rid of Medicare Part D. Because the thing is, the way that it was designed, it's leveraged what we do best in terms of, from a government standpoint, ensuring some amount of security for people, but also it's preserved that private space so that it didn't create those enemies that would take it down. And so I think that where we are is we still have a system in a district like mine where I hear constantly people saying, I don't think we can do X, Y, or Z. People are always up in arms at me for saying that I believe our right next step is a public health insurance option. And they're just like, that's a bridge too far. And I say we have a responsibility to 30 million Americans for them to be urgently covered. And it's going to come by hook or by crook, right? That's why I love having Jamal Bowman in the House of Representatives next year, because it's just like, listen, there is pressure. There is pressure to do this urgently. It's going to happen. So let's figure out how. And when I say next steps, I say we already have a system that covers the majority of Americans. Let's cover that last 30 million Americans. Let's also make sure that our rural hospitals are adequately funded, because understanding that if we reimbursed at Medicare rates for all of these hospitals, my rural hospitals in my district would close. I see Samar being like, yeah, it's tough out here, right? And so we've had 150 rural hospitals closed since 2010, 15 in the year 2020 alone. So the way that we design these programs has to be with the notion of access being preserved. I'm gonna give one last lesson before I break, because you're gonna get me in my bag right now. But the one last thing that I'll say is that access to healthcare is not just health insurance. And we need to get out of that mindset, right? Access to healthcare exists along, I'll say, 10 different dimensions, but there are 5 that everybody needs to understand. The first is approachability. You need to have a healthcare system that people know they can access. People understand and recognize they have a need, and they know they need to seek that care. And there are a lot of things to get in the way of that. The next is acceptability. And that's about having, the diversity of our physician workforce, our provider workforce. It's culturally appropriate from a gender standpoint, religion standpoint, race standpoint, all these different factors. Then next is the availability and accommodation. What are the hours that it's open? What does transportation look like? We got hospitals people can't even access because it's not on the, from a transportation standpoint, it's not accessible. We got people here in Virginia who say they can't come to my hospital because it's quote unquote across the mountain, right? On the other side of the mountain. And then finally, when you talk about beyond that, then there's affordability. That's where your insurance comes in. And then finally, there's the acceptability, or the appropriateness rather. That last piece is, are we delivering the right care to everybody? We've got to do all of those things if we want to accomplish that goal of everybody having access to care. And so for me, I'm always ruminating on how do we take the next steps toward a more perfect healthcare system in this United States of America, understanding that the ACA folks tried 70 plus times to repeal that pretty conservative legislation that right now just eked over 50% of the population saying they're in favor of it, right? And so it's just like, we've got steps to make right now, and my patients are depending on it. And so that's where I'm just like, I use every ounce of my medical degree, my law degree, my time in the White House, my time as director of health policy to say, what can I bring to this conversation to make sure we march forward definitively?
No, thank you for that. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a prime example of what happens when you elect people into office who actually knows what they're talking about. So go vote for him. But also just to say, we either as a society pay for these things on the front end, or unfortunately we pay for on the back end when people go broke, become homeless. So let's reevaluate how we utilize our resources for our communities. That being said, I want to thank you all for allowing me to moderate this conversation. Shout out to Collective PAC for allowing me to wear a hoodie that says "Schools Not Prisons." But I get the opportunity to pass it back over to my colleague, Chris, who's going to close us out with the last section, as well as to close us out with the program.
So, one, I feel like we had so many gems of knowledge just over the past 40 minutes. It's amazing what we have coming into our halls, our state houses, our Congress. So I know we actually have two candidates that still have candidate obligations coming up at 7. So I want to go to them first, and then I want to hit the rest of our panel. So starting with Samara and Jamal, we heard a lot about being ready for this exact moment, and that you have all the tools that you need to be ready. But like Rep Lee let us know, what was the moment for you that you knew, hey, it should be me, it can be me, let me go do this? And I'm gonna start with Samara.
Oh, I'm so glad I get to end on this question. And by the way, the thing I have to leave for is the debate. So I want to thank you all for giving me this energy, because if I wasn't amped up before, I'm like, I cannot let these people down. I got to go show up and show them what it looks like when we show up. So, first of all, I just want to be clear, especially for young people who get into this, there will be moments after you win when you're sitting in your chamber that you still say, am I sure I can do this? Do I have what it takes? I know a lot of folks here were in competitive primaries, so they're essentially shoo-in for a general. And I'm sure there are still days you wake up to say, can I really do this? But there was one moment for me, and that was watching one of the great, yes, imposter syndrome, exactly. That is exactly what it's called. One of the most brilliant women leaders that our country has seen, and that is Stacey Abrams. Watching her speak to all sorts of groups of people, sharing her story, being rooted in her narrative, and using that to share why she believes Georgia should be moving more progressively and moving into things like criminal justice reform and giving healthcare to everyone. Listening to her story really turned a corner for me, because I didn't think that someone who didn't have the White House internship and the Ivy League degree and the multi-generational wealth, I didn't think that there was a path for that type of person to enter public service, whether it's because you do have to raise. We've had to raise $500,000 for this race. You heard Rep Lee talk about that. This is huge. These are really major barriers that you have to cross to get into this service. But it was listening to Stacey Abrams talk about how her experiences as a Black woman, as a small business owner, growing up low income, how those things, having student debt, how those things made her perfectly equipped to be governor. And I always have to share this with everyone, but just so we all know, more Democrats voted for Stacey Abrams, even though she did not win that governorship because of voter suppression. More people voted for her, more Democrats voted for her than had ever voted for anyone in the history of Governor Georgia elections. And that's just to show that there are all these steps that we have to take. And sometimes our path looks different. And sometimes we don't get a win on the first try. But think about all that she has opened. I would not be standing here today if I hadn't been in that one random room, which, by the way, was a high dollar fundraiser that someone invited me to because I didn't have the money to get there. So that's the other thing, right? Anyone can come to anything I do. We have to be able to open this up to more people. But being able to see myself for the first time on that stage in the public arena and the political arena completely changed the trajectory. I jumped down a flight down to Georgia, went down rural Georgia, door knocking in 2018, came home and said, all right, let's do this. So that was a huge moment for me. And I'll spend the rest of my career trying to create those moments for other young people who might want to jump in. And thank you all. I am going to hop off, but thank you so much for having me here today.
Well, best of luck to you in your debate. Thank you for all the knowledge you dropped. Jamal, coming to you next. What was the moment that you knew, especially because you were going against somebody that a lot of people deemed unbeatable, had been there for a while. So what was the moment that you knew you was ready for this?
Yeah, so I don't know if it was a single moment, but definitely watching the squad and what they were able to do, not just winning their election, but just disrupting and dismantling the entire system from the inside out. I mean, we're talking 4 women of color going up against a white patriarchy in Congress day in and day out, just speaking truth to power and showing incredible leadership. Just their language and their demeanor and what they represented, just watching that from afar, told me that there was a space for me in Congress and in elected office. But the year before I decided to run, 34 children died within the K-12 school system in the Bronx, and 17 died via suicide. And right across the highway from my school, a young girl was bullied. A young ninth grader was bullied in school. Right after school, she goes to the top of one of the buildings in Co-op City and jumps off the building. And right down the road at New Rochelle High School, two girls get into a conflict. One pulls out a knife, stabs the other in the chest, and kills her. And there's no elected officials talking with any sort of urgency about what the hell is going on with our kids and what are we going to do about it. And no one was making a connection between those outcomes, the trauma our kids deal with, the poverty that they live within, and the bad policy that comes from Washington. No one was making the connections, especially Congressman Ingle. And the last thing I'll say about him, I literally looked at the numbers from 2018. And what I noticed was out of 350,000 registered Democrats in our district, only 30,000 voted in the primary, and he won with 22,000 votes against three other challengers. I said to myself, like, yo, I could knock on 22,000 doors myself and get people to come out to vote for us and beat him. And what ended up happening is we were able to build a freaking movement because people throughout the district, and young people in particular, were waiting for a candidate that they could connect with in an authentic way that they could get behind and support. And that's why we were able to ultimately win by 16 points. So even though he was considered unbeatable and part of the machine, what we noticed very early was the machine was a myth, and the machine was a lot weaker than people may have thought it was. We didn't go to the machine. We didn't ask anyone permission. We didn't call county leaders or any of that. We went directly to the people, and we stayed with the people from the beginning, and that's how we were ultimately able to pull it out.
I know that when you get to Congress, I always hear Congresswoman Presley say, we have to pull the people that are closest to the pain to the power. I know for a fact that New York is absolutely going to get that out of you, but also a lot of people around this country are going to have a fierce advocate when you get to Congress. So I know you have to go. I don't want to keep you any longer, but thank you so much for all the knowledge that you dropped.
Peace and love, y'all. Good to see you again, Summer. Nice to meet you, Dr. Webb. I'll see you soon, man.
All right, Rep. Lee, coming to you next. When was the moment, or when were the few moments that led you to believe that you were ready for this and get you to step forward?
Yeah, believe it or not, I think maybe I'm like a lot of folks, right? I didn't think that I could run until the very moment that I was going to run. Not could run. I didn't think that I would run until the moment that I did. I wasn't, sitting around thinking about like, maybe one day I'll run for office. Like that wasn't something that I was not on that trajectory. At least I didn't think I was, and other folks in the world definitely thought differently. For me, I ended up being an organizer in 2016 for the presidential, which was an awful job. It was awful. We were working like 100 hours a week. We lost. But something told me the whole time, I wanted to quit from the very day that I got there. But there was a little something, I don't know what it was. I don't know what it was to this very day. It was a little something that told me to stay in it, right? So fast forward, and then I started to, because I organized in my district during that time, I was one of the few organizers on a national campaign that organized their actual districts. Then because of that, I was able to take what I learned there and transfer it to helping my community. When we had a school board situation where our school board was rogue, where our school district was off track, where my school district was getting international news for Black kids getting, abused by cops. We were able to organize and really put that into motion and just start to organize really quickly. And in 3 weeks, we were able to get in a whole new school board. Because of the work we did in a 3-week write-in campaign for some folks, we were able to flip 4 seats, get a whole new administration. And now our school is on an entirely different trajectory. And because of that, I thought that if we had people to vote for, like I said, when Black folks got someone to vote for, they'll come out and vote. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to help find more young Black folks to run. I wanted us to run in every single seat, whether it's magistrate or school board or the state house or Congress, whatever it may be. What we saw is that, just like Brother Bowman said, these folks were not undefeatable. We looked at those numbers too. And when we looked at those numbers, it was stark. We were seeing folks win, people who had not had opponents in 20 years, folks who had not had opponents for decades. I had never had someone to vote for other than the person who was my rep, who I took out. We were seeing that up and down the ballot. And then we just started a progressive movement. It just takes one seed sometimes. Someone just said, you should run. And I've not thought about it. I'd never considered it. But then I realized that I couldn't lead somebody where I wasn't willing to go myself. So just that one person saying you should run was the spark that really made me consider it. And then going back to my community and seeing what they wanted and what they needed gave me the encouragement that I needed to do it. So I think, again, just like others, it was kind of a process. And seeing other folks, I didn't have the squad to look to. We came in all at the same time. We came in at that same progressive wave. But now seeing the impact of that on other people running is incredible. It's amazing to see that now young Black women know that they can run, not just think, they know that they can do this. It may take 1 or 2 or 3 times, but they know they can do it. So I hope that just like someone had to spark it for me, just seeing young Black women get into the school board sparked it for me, hopefully seeing me get into this position will spark it for someone else.
So I hope we are definitely going to have you in as a guest trainer for next year's class of Black Campaign School with all the knowledge and inspiration you can drop in. Last but not least, Dr. Webb, you are transitioning, going from being Dr. Webb to wanting to represent people in the halls of Congress. What was that moment that changed everything for you to step into the moment you're in now?
Well, I'll always be Dr. Webb, right? Like, I think the way I see it is, my profession is actually my passion. That's for healing. And that's healing in a clinical space, but also in community spaces. So I think it's important for me to bring that healing mentality to a lot of our spaces. I'll start off by saying, I definitely can't pretend that the imposter syndrome doesn't exist, but I grew up in a family where, my mom told me I could do anything. So, that mentality, having somebody behind you who's just like, yeah, if you want to do it, you can do it. That's powerful. For me, I came out of working in the White House, came out of that experience back into my community, having seen all the levers you can pull between 23 federal offices and agencies to benefit our communities, and realizing we're just not pulling those levers and we're not doing it efficiently and we're not helping people. I think that was the first piece of it. I think that ultimately it was the threat to the Affordable Care Act. It was that lawsuit that's going before the Supreme Court on November 10th, and that idea that we're going to strip coverage, very likely, from 20 million Americans. And then who's going to be there to pick up the pieces? And I kept saying, I got to find a way to help. I've spent all these years, I got all this student loan debt just so I can be helpful in moments like this, and I got to do something right now. And for me, I just prayed about it a lot. My faith is central to who I am. I prayed about it a lot and ended up meditating on this verse in the book of Esther. It's 4:14. She's talking to her cousin Mordecai, and that her people are in trouble. And he says, well, sometimes you're called for such a time as this, to his cousin Esther, who's the queen. And that idea of being called for such a time as this, that's what motivated me. It was just like, maybe it is the fact that so much of my path has led me to a moment where I could use the background, the skill set, the expertise. And what's fun, I love how earlier we were talking about being unapologetically authentic, because that's how I approach my campaign. But I always tell folks, I don't have to do credential signaling, because, for me, in a political space, most folks aren't used to seeing a doctor, let alone a doctor lawyer. And so I don't spend any time trying to establish my credentials. I spend all my time trying to build with people. And then I'm just like, I'm building with people, and you should take it on good faith that I got you when it comes to addressing healthcare issues in this country. And I think that for me, I just realized it's built for the moment. Going back to my faith, the confirmation was that here we are encountering a global health pandemic. The confirmation was here we are in a national crisis of racial injustice. And then my bio on my School of Medicine website is like, he's a physician who works at the intersection of health and social justice, right? Like this is an election season that was built for me. And it was built for me to step in with my leadership and my perspective. Does that mean that I win this race in 9 days? I don't know. If that's how God chooses to use me through this, then great. But if it was just simply to make sure that here I am making the arguments that folks need to hear, And I put Dr. Cameron Webb on everything because maybe some 5-year-old kid is seeing me and saying, I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be like Dr. Webb someday, because that's how I was inspired to be a doctor. I think it's just kind of leaning into the moment. So that's what I'd say.
Wow. Just wow. Well, I know we are at our deadline time. You all really, I think, show for our audience that the future is in good hands, that you all are definitely the definition of when we talk about building Black political power, it looks just like you. And then also I have to shout out my outstanding co-moderator, Jamira, for all the knowledge that she dropped, but also just putting on the fire conversation and running it so smoothly. So from us at the Collective PAC, so much, Dr. Webb, Rep. Lee, Jamira, Samara, Jamal, who is no longer with us right now. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We definitely look forward to working with you in the future and continuing to build with you and have your back and support to make sure you continue to move up in wherever you want to go in your careers in life. You definitely have a partner in us. And with that, I want to say to everybody, please have a great evening. Thank you for tuning in to our 12th edition. We will be back on Wednesday with our final edition before this election, and it will be a one-on-one conversation between actor and advocate Michael Ealy and Democratic nominee for the U.S. Senate in South Carolina, Jamie Harrison. So thank you all for joining us again, and continue to build Black political power. Good night, folks.